Deep within the sprawling savannas of the Serengeti, where golden grass stretches endlessly toward horizons painted in amber and crimson, a legend was being forged, not in myth or folklore, whispered around campfires, but in the blood-soaked dust of 1,000 confrontations. A single lion, one magnificent creature of muscle, claw, and an intelligence that seemed to defy nature itself. For 14 consecutive years, this legendary beast never lost a single fight. Not once, not even against odds that should have destroyed him. Scientists who studied him called him Kota. Rangers who tracked him spoke his name with a mixture of awe and dread. Villagers in the surrounding regions whispered about him as if he were something more than animal, more than predator. He was a force of nature given flesh, a warrior whose reign seemed destined to outlast all challenges. But before we unravel the extraordinary story of how one lion defied every law of nature for over a decade, you need to understand something crucial. What we witnessed with Kota challenged everything wildlife experts believed about lion behavior, about dominance hierarchies, about the very limits of what a single animal could achieve through sheer force of will. If you're someone who loves stories of nature's greatest warriors, of animals that push beyond their biological limits, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear will change how you see the African wilderness forever. The story of Kota doesn't begin with his legendary battles. It begins with a mystery, a cub born in 1981 in the northern reaches of the Serengeti, during a season of unusual abundance. His mother was a lioness of exceptional size and strength, a characteristic that would pass down to her offspring in ways that would eventually reshape the pride structure of an entire region. From his earliest days, Kota was different. While his littermates remained small and vulnerable, struggling through the first dangerous months of infancy, Kota grew at an unnatural pace. His paws were disproportionately large, his shoulders unusually broad for a young cub. Ragnars, who observed him from a distance, noted something unsettling in his amber eyes, a depth of intelligence that seemed beyond his years, a burning intensity that suggested he understood the violent world he was born into far better than any cub should. The Serengeti is a teacher that accepts no excuses. Young lions learn early that weakness equals death. Predators, hyenas, and disease claim cubs with brutal regularity. Survival rates for lion cubs rarely exceed 50%, but Kota was surviving in ways that defied statistical probability. At barely 6 months old, he was already displaying hunting prowess that typically didn't emerge until 12 to 18 months. His movements were fluid, precise, economical. Every action served a purpose. Every strike was calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum wasted energy. By the time his first full year had passed, Kota had already killed prey that many adult lions struggled with. An impala at 7 months old, a young zebra at 10 months, a warthog, dangerous and aggressive, at 14 months. The other cubs in his mother's pride began to avoid him, not out of respect, but out of fear. Even at that young age, there was something in his presence that made other lions instinctively cautious. His mother's pride noticed it too. The lionesses would exchange glances when Kota passed, their body language revealing a concern that transcended normal family dynamics. But it was Kota's father who understood first what this cub represented. Mamba was the pride male, a massive lion in his prime, nearly 470 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. He had held his territory through sheer dominance for 4 years, defeating every challenger, commanding respect through fear. Most male lions are territorial toward cubs that aren't their own, sometimes even toward their own offspring. But when Mamba first witnessed Kota hunting with precision that matched his own, something shifted in his eyes. He recognized what he was seeing, not just a promising young lion, but a potential successor, an heir that might actually possess the capability to surpass him. For the first time in his reign, Mamba felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but a recognition of mortality, an understanding that his dominance had an expiration date. Kota's relationship with his father became the defining feature of his adolescence. Rather than driving the young lion out of the pride as was customary, Mamba began to teach him, actively, deliberately, the kind of mentorship that rarely occurs in the wild, where survival is personal and territory is everything. But Mamba seemed to understand that Kota was destined for something greater than his current pride. The old lion would take his son on hunts, demonstrating techniques that had served him well, teaching him not just how to kill, but how to do it with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. Rangers documented these hunts, noting the unusual cooperation, the way Kotar learned by observation and imitation, absorbing lessons that would normally take years to develop. By the time Kotar reached his 3rd year, he was already 420 pounds, nearly as large as his father. His mane, which should have been darkening into maturity, possessed an unusual quality. It wasn't the typical golden brown of most Serengeti lions. Kotar's mane was darker, almost black at the roots, spreading across his shoulders like a crown of obsidian. His physical presence had become genuinely intimidating. Other pride members would move aside when he approached. Lionesses averted their eyes. Younger males understood instinctively that challenging him would be suicide. Mamba, seeing what his son had become, made a decision that shocked the rangers observing his pride. He voluntarily stepped back from his dominant position. This was virtually unheard of in lion society. Males fought to the death to maintain their status. They didn't willingly surrender their harems, their territories, their place at the top of the hierarchy. But Mamba did exactly that, acknowledging his son's superior strength and recognizing that the future of his bloodline depended on Kotar's dominance rather than his own diminishing reign. Kotar officially took control of the pride in 1984 at just 3 years old, the youngest age at which a male lion had ever been recorded, assuming complete dominance of a prime territory. Rangers who had been documenting the pride for years were stunned by the smooth transition, by the way every member of the pride accepted Kotar's supremacy without serious challenge. His first act as the ruling male was to establish absolute boundaries. Any male lion that ventured even close to his pride's territory received a warning that was unmistakable in its severity. A roar so powerful that rangers reported it could be heard over 20 kilometers away. A presence so commanding that rival males would retreat without ever coming within sight of him. For years there had been a constant pressure on this pride's territory, from younger males seeking to claim their own domains. That pressure ceased almost immediately after Kotar's ascension. What made Kotar exceptional wasn't just his size or his strength, though those were undeniable factors. It was something deeper, something more complex. Scientists who began studying him intensely during this period noted an intelligence that seemed almost human in its sophistication. He demonstrated strategic thinking. He showed the ability to learn from mistakes and adjust his tactics accordingly. He exhibited what could only be described as emotional intelligence, understanding the complex dynamics of his pride, recognizing individual lionesses and their specific capabilities, sometimes positioning them for hunts in ways that maximized their effectiveness rather than his own glory. This was a lion who understood that his dominance was strengthened through the success of his entire pride, not just his individual power. By 1986, when Kotar was just 5 years old, the first serious challenger arrived. A coalition of 3 young males, hardened by years of wandering, driven by hunger and ambition, decided that the Serengeti's most wealthy territory should be theirs. They had defeated other prides. They had claimed smaller territories. Now they wanted the prize that every male lion in the region coveted, the pride that Kotar commanded. The 3 males approached from the east, roaring challenges into the wind, their intentions unmistakable. What followed would be the first recorded fight that would define Kotar's legendary status. The battle erupted near the pride's central watering hole, and rangers managed to document the entire confrontation from a safe distance. What they witnessed challenged their understanding of lion combat. The 3 coalition males came at Kotar as a unit, using tactics that had served them well against other prides. Circle, attack from multiple angles, overwhelm through numbers. Against most lions, this strategy would have been devastating. Against Kotar, it proved catastrophic for the attackers. The first male lunged for Kotar's flank. Kotar didn't try to avoid the attack. Instead, he pivoted, catching the attacker mid-leap and using the male's own momentum against him. The sound of the impact was like thunder. The challenger crashed to the ground so hard the wind was knocked from his lungs. He struggled to rise, and when he did, he limped away from the confrontation, 2 ribs visibly broken, his fighting spirit shattered. The second male, learning from his coalition brother's mistake, tried a different approach, going straight for Kotar's throat. For a moment, the outcome seemed uncertain. 2 massive predators locked together, neither willing to yield. But Kotar had already anticipated this move. He twisted violently, breaking the other male's grip, then drove his own jaws toward his opponent's shoulder, biting down with 650 psi of pressure. The challenger screamed, a sound that echoed across the plains and broke away from the engagement, blood pouring from his shoulder. The third male, watching his coalition mates being systematically dismantled, made a different calculation. He turned and ran. Simple as that. Survival instinct overrode ambition. He retreated into the bush, and Kotar didn't pursue. The young lion stood in the center of the watering hole, breathing heavily, unmarked by the engagement, while his two defeated opponents limped away into the distance. The entire fight had lasted less than 3 minutes. For the first time, the rangers watching understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a typical dominance struggle between lions. This was a level of combat mastery that seemed to transcend normal predator behavior. Word of Kotar's first significant victory spread quickly through the animal communication networks of the Serengeti. Lions use complex scent marking and vocalizations to communicate across vast distances. Within days, every lion in the region knew about the 3 males who had challenged Kotar and lost. The effect was immediate. Fewer males ventured near his territory. Those who did approached with caution rather than aggression. Kotar's reputation was already beginning to form, even at this early stage of his dominance. Rangers who had been observing the Serengeti for decades noted that they had never seen such rapid establishment of dominance hierarchy. Usually a young male had to fight multiple times before achieving stable control of his territory. Kotar seemed to have accomplished this in a single confrontation. But Kotar's legend didn't truly begin in 1986. That was merely the prologue. The real story, the extraordinary chronicle that would eventually baffle scientists and reshape our understanding of lion behavior, was just beginning to unfold. It would take another year, another challenger, and another demonstration of combat superiority before Kotar would earn his place in the annals of African wildlife history, a place that he would hold for 14 consecutive years without yielding to a single opponent. By 1987, Kotar's reputation had grown beyond the immediate Serengeti region. Researchers from wildlife institutes across East Africa had begun to hear rumors of an extraordinary lion whose dominance seemed absolute. Initial reports were dismissed as exaggeration, the kind of embellished storytelling that often accompanies wildlife folklore. But then the documentation began. Photographs, video footage, detailed field observations from multiple independent researchers. The evidence was undeniable. A single lion had established a territorial control so complete that it was reshaping the entire ecosystem around him. Predator-prey dynamics shifted as Kotar's hunting success rate climbed to unprecedented levels. Prey animal populations began to migrate away from his core territory, seeking safer grounds. Competing predators like leopards and hyenas learned to operate in the shadows of his domain, hunting smaller prey, avoiding direct confrontation at all costs. Dr. Marcus Okonkwo was one of the first wildlife scientists to formally study Kotar. A renowned expert in lion behavior with 20 years of field experience, Okonkwo arrived at the Serengeti in late 1987 with a specific mission: to understand how a single lion could establish such dominance and maintain it without serious challenge. What he discovered would occupy his research for the next 7 years and ultimately change how the scientific community understood lion intelligence and combat strategy. In his initial observations, Okonkwo noted something that most casual observers missed. Kotar wasn't just physically superior to other lions, he was strategically superior. He had developed what could only be described as a combat philosophy. Every movement was purposeful. Every engagement followed a pattern that suggested deep thinking rather than instinctual reaction. When a group of 4 young males attempted to challenge Kotar in early 1988, Okonkwo and his team documented the entire encounter from multiple angles. The challengers approached during daylight hours, a tactical mistake born from overconfidence. Kotar was resting in the shade of an acacia tree when the males announced their presence with loud roars. A typical lion would have immediately responded with counter roars, establishing position before engaging. Kotar did something different. He remained silent. He remained still. The 4 males, confused by the lack of response, grew bolder. They approached closer, their roars becoming more aggressive, their body language increasingly confrontational. Kotar watched them approach with what Okonkwo later described as calculated patience. When the males were just 30 meters away, Kotar finally rose from his resting position, but he didn't charge directly at them. Instead, he walked toward them with a measured pace, his enormous body moving with fluid grace that belied his 480-pound mass. His mane, dark and magnificent, seemed to grow larger as it caught the sunlight, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed almost sentient, locked onto the lead challenger. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The boldness that had characterized the four males' approach evaporated. Their roars became uncertain. Their body language shifted from aggressive to defensive. One of the males actually began backing away before any physical contact had occurred. Kotar took another step forward, and the psychological warfare intensified. By the time he reached them, 3 of the 4 males had already begun their retreat. Only the largest challenger attempted to stand his ground. That confrontation lasted 45 seconds. The challenger lunged. Kotar sidestepped with surprising agility for an animal of his size and delivered a single precise strike to the male's shoulder that dropped him to the ground. The lion lay there gasping for breath, clearly defeated not just physically but psychologically. Kotar stood over him, didn't deliver a killing bite, didn't press the advantage. He simply stood there, asserting dominance through presence alone. The message was unmistakable. Kotar could kill him if he chose to. That he didn't was an act of mercy, not weakness. The defeated male dragged himself away, his entire body language screaming submission and fear. Okonkwo recorded this encounter with meticulous detail. What struck him most profoundly was what he called Kotar's psychological dominance strategy. The lion wasn't just winning fights through superior physical ability, he was winning them through superior mental tactics. He understood fear, he understood intimidation, he understood how to break an opponent's will before their bodies ever made contact. This was a level of predatory sophistication that went far beyond documented lion behavior. Throughout 1988 and 1989, challenges continued to arrive. Young males, old males, coalition groups attempting to claim Kotar's territory. Without exception, Kotar defeated them. But what made his victories truly remarkable was the consistent pattern. He never fought harder than necessary. He never extended engagements longer than required. Each fight was swift, decisive, and left his opponents with clear psychological scars alongside their physical injuries. Rangers began to notice that lions who had challenged Kotar and survived would never challenge him again. More remarkably, they would actively avoid his territory, sometimes traveling considerable distances to hunt in less desirable areas rather than risk another encounter with him. By 1990, Kotar had been the undisputed ruler of his territory for 6 years, 6 years without a single defeat, 6 years of perfect record against all challengers. The scientific community began to take serious notice. International wildlife journals published papers examining his unprecedented success. Documentaries were filmed about his life and dominance, but the scientific establishment remained skeptical about attributing his success to anything beyond physical superiority and luck. Intelligence, emotional complexity, strategic thinking, these were concepts typically reserved for primate study, not big cat behavior. Yet the evidence was mounting in ways that were difficult to ignore. In 1991, something happened that would force the scientific community to reconsider its assumptions about Kotar. A coalition of 5 males, the largest alliance ever formed against him, attacked simultaneously. They had been watching him, learning his patterns, coordinating their strategy with an intelligence that suggested they understood his typical tactics. They attacked at dawn, when lions are typically drowsy and less alert. They came from multiple directions, not randomly, but in a coordinated pattern designed to prevent him from using his superior mobility against them. For the first time in 7 years, Kotar faced a challenge that seemed genuinely dangerous. The fight erupted with brutal intensity. 5 males against 1, each weighing between 400 and 440 pounds, all in their prime years. The advantage should have been overwhelming. Okonkwo, who was watching from a safe distance, later wrote that he genuinely believed he was about to witness Kotar's first defeat. The 5 males worked in coordination that suggested genuine tactical planning. They didn't all attack at once. 2 would engage while 3 positioned themselves for follow-up assaults. When Kotar threw one attacker aside, 2 others would exploit the opening. For nearly 4 minutes, the largest and most sophisticated challenge to his dominance continued, and for the first time, Kotar was on the defensive rather than the offensive. But then something shifted. Okonkwo described it as a moment of clarity, as if Kotar suddenly recognized the pattern of their attack and understood exactly how to dismantle it. The young lion's movements changed. They became faster, more aggressive, more focused. He stopped defending and started attacking. He targeted the weakest of the 5 males, isolating him and striking with absolute precision. When the male went down, Kotar didn't pursue further. He immediately shifted his attention to the next challenger, breaking their coordination by eliminating their rhythm. Within 90 seconds, 3 of the 5 males were either down or fleeing. The remaining 2 recognized that the tide had turned catastrophically against them and retreated at full speed. Kotar emerged from that fight, visibly wounded for the first time, deep cuts along his side, a torn ear, blood matting his magnificent mane, but he was standing victorious, and the 5 challengers were scattered across the plains, several of them severely injured. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone observing. Even against the most sophisticated challenge yet mounted, Kotar had emerged victorious. More importantly, he had demonstrated the ability to analyze a tactical situation, recognize patterns, and adapt his strategy mid-fight. This level of cognitive complexity pushed the boundaries of what most scientists believed lions were capable of. Following the 5-male coalition fight, Kotar's legend truly crystallized. He became more than just a dominant lion. He became something mythical. Local communities in villages surrounding the Serengeti began to incorporate him into their oral traditions. Stories were told around evening fires about the great lion who could never be defeated, whose strength came not just from his body but from his mind, whose dominance was so complete that it seemed to transcend nature itself. Some villagers spoke of him with reverence, others with fear. All spoke of him with absolute belief that he was something extraordinary, something that appeared only once in many generations. Between 1991 and 1995, Kotar faced an estimated 17 separate challenges, some from individual males, some from coalitions. One particularly noteworthy encounter involved a coalition of 4 large males who had successfully dominated a neighboring territory for 3 years before deciding to challenge Kotar. These weren't inexperienced young males. These were proven fighters with battle scars and documented kill records. The clash between Kotar's pride and the 4 challenger males lasted nearly 6 hours, with the territorial boundary shifting back and forth multiple times. By the end of the confrontation, all 4 males had retreated, and Kotar stood bloodied but undefeated. Dr. Okonkwo, who had now been studying Kotar for nearly 8 years, published his groundbreaking paper in 1995 titled Adaptive Combat Strategy and Cognitive Complexity in Panthera leo, the Case of a Serengeti Apex Predator. In the paper, Okonkwo presented evidence that Kotar demonstrated levels of strategic thinking, pattern recognition, and tactical adaptation that were typically associated with primates rather than felids. He documented fight-by-fight analysis showing how Kotar's tactics evolved, how he learned from encounters, how he seemed to anticipate opponent moves before they occurred. The paper was controversial, with many scientists dismissing Okonkwo's interpretations as anthropomorphizing animal behavior. But the data was solid, the evidence was substantial, and the implications were undeniable. By 1996, Kotar was 15 years old. In the wild, male lions rarely survive past 12 or 13 years. The combination of injuries from territorial fights, the physical demands of hunting, disease, and simple wear and tear on the body typically takes a toll that proves fatal. Yet Kotar showed no signs of aging. His movements remained fluid. His strength appeared undiminished. His mane, though now bearing some silver at the edges, remained magnificent. Researchers began to wonder if they were looking at a genuine biological anomaly, an animal whose physiology was somehow different from typical lions. Blood samples were taken and analyzed, revealing nothing unusual from a genetic standpoint. Yet something was allowing Kotar to defy the normal aging process that affected other lions. Between 1995 and 1998, Kotar faced 8 more significant challenges. Each one was documented in meticulous detail by Okonkwo and his expanding research team. Each one resulted in victory for Kotar. The cumulative record was now undeniable: 14 years without a single loss, over 25 documented fights, ranging from individual challenges to coalition attacks involving up to 5 males. Not one defeat. The statistical probability of such a record occurring purely through chance was astronomical. Something else was at work, something that transcended typical predator behavior. One particularly fascinating observation came during a 1997 encounter. A young male, barely 5 years old and relatively small for his age, attempted to challenge Kotar. The challenger was clearly outmatched from the beginning. Any reasonable expectation would have suggested that Kotar would defeat him quickly and thoroughly. perhaps even fatally. Instead, something remarkable happened. Kotar seemed to hold back. He fought with enough intensity to make clear his dominance, but not with his full power. He didn't press for a killing blow. He actually seemed to be teaching the young male, demonstrating superior technique while allowing him to learn from the encounter without sustaining permanent damage. When the fight ended, the young male retreated to a safe distance, visibly shaken but not seriously injured. Okonkwo interpreted this behavior as evidence of something approaching compassion, or at least a recognition that this young male posed no genuine threat and therefore wasn't worth killing. It suggested that Kotar's dominance came with a kind of restraint, a selective application of his lethal capabilities based on whether the opponent truly warranted execution. This was cognitive behavior at an extremely sophisticated level. By the turn of the millennium in 1999 and 2000, Kotar was approaching 20 years old. At this age, even the strongest lions typically show significant decline. Yet observers noted that while Kotar had slowed somewhat, he remained formidable. His strength, while perhaps not quite what it had been in his prime, was still superior to any challenger. His intelligence seemed to have only deepened with age. He moved with an efficiency born of experience, waste no energy, conserve every movement for maximum effect. The final years of Kotar's reign brought a kind of peace to the Serengeti that hadn't existed before. Other male lions, recognizing the futility of challenging him, simply accepted his dominance. The constant pressure on his territory ceased. Challengers came from farther and farther away. Young males who had never seen Kotar, who didn't understand his reputation, who thought they might be the one to finally claim victory against the legendary lion. Without exception, they learned otherwise. Kotar's record over 14 years stood at perfect: 0 defeats, 28 documented significant fights, 28 victories. The statistical improbability of this record was so extreme that it pushed beyond luck or even exceptional talent. There had to be something more fundamental at work, something that challenged our understanding of what a single animal could achieve through the combination of physical superiority, intelligence, tactical adaptability, and an apparently unbreakable will to dominate. By 2001, the scientific establishment had begun to genuinely grapple with what Kotar represented. Dr. Okonkwo's research had spawned numerous follow-up studies. Universities across Africa and Europe launched their own investigations into Kotar's behavior. Documentaries had been filmed, international journals had published extensive analyses. The lion who had never lost a fight had become something of a celebrity in the world of wildlife research, yet also a source of profound scientific puzzlement. How could a single animal maintain such dominance for so long? What genetic or behavioral factors could explain his extraordinary success? Was he truly an anomaly, or did he represent capabilities that existed in other lions but were simply never expressed? One particularly fascinating study, conducted by Dr. Helena Kumari from the University of Cape Town, focused on what she called Kotar's recovery physiology. Kumari documented that while Kotar sustained injuries in his fights, the speed at which he healed was notably faster than typical for lions of his age. Wounds that would normally take weeks to fully close and scar over seemed to resolve in days. Minor infections that might become serious in other lions appeared to be fought off with remarkable efficiency. Kumari theorized that Kotar's immune system might be operating at an exceptionally high level, possibly due to genetic factors, possibly due to environmental factors, possibly due to something else entirely. But the data was clear. This lion healed faster, fought better, and endured longer than any comparable animal. Another breakthrough came from behavioral psychologist Dr. James Whitmore, who spent 3 years studying Kotar's pre-fight behavior patterns. Whitmore documented what he called psychological priming rituals. Before each significant encounter, Kotar engaged in specific behaviors that seemed designed to psychologically prepare himself and simultaneously intimidate his opponent. These behaviors weren't random. They followed a consistent pattern: specific vocalizations, specific territorial markings, specific positioning relative to the sun and wind. Whitmore theorized that Kotar had developed almost ceremonial combat preparations that served to focus his mental state while simultaneously creating psychological pressure on his opponents. The effect was subtle but profound. Opponents facing Kotar seemed already partially defeated before physical contact ever occurred. In 2002, as Kotar approached 21 years old, something unprecedented happened. A coalition of 7 males, the largest group ever to challenge him, gathered with apparent coordination. These weren't young, inexperienced fighters. These were proven warriors, each with their own territorial histories, each with documented kills. Rangers and researchers who observed the gathering knew that this would be the ultimate test, 7 against 1. By any reasonable calculation, even Kotar's superior abilities shouldn't be able to overcome such overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The battle, which historians of this event have come to call the Last Great War, erupted in late June of 2002 during the dry season, when tensions between competing prides reached their peak. The 7 males attacked with clear strategic coordination. They had apparently observed Kotar's patterns, understood his typical responses, and developed a plan designed to exploit his weaknesses. The first wave of attacks came from 3 directions simultaneously, preventing Kotar from focusing on a single opponent. When he dealt with one threat, another emerged from a different angle. The coordination was sophisticated enough that even Okonkwo, watching from a distance, believed he was witnessing the moment when Kotar's legendary reign would finally end. For nearly 8 minutes, the battle raged with an intensity that seemed to surpass even the 5-male coalition fight of 1991. Kotar was surrounded, attacked from multiple angles, pressed harder than he had been in years. His breathing became labored. Blood flowed from multiple cuts and puncture wounds. One attacker managed to clamp his jaws around Kotar's hindquarters, and for a moment the great lion seemed to be in genuine danger of being brought down through pure weight of numbers. But then something remarkable occurred. Observers would later describe it as a moment of absolute fury, a tapping into reserves of power that seemed to transcend normal biological capability. Kotar's entire body seemed to expand. His roar shook the earth. He threw off the attacker at his hindquarters with a violent twist, turned with a speed that belied his age, and began methodically dismantling the coalition's coordination. One by one, the 7 males began to fall back or go down. The second male was struck with such force that ribs audibly cracked. The third suffered a terrible wound to his flank that left him bleeding so heavily he could barely stand. The 4th and 5th attempted to flee but were caught and struck before they could escape. By the time the 8th minute transitioned into the 9th, only 2 of the 7 males remained engaged. The other 5 were retreating, some limping badly, some visibly traumatized by the experience. The 2 remaining attackers, seeing their coalition brothers fall, made the tactical decision to retreat before they joined their injured comrades. Kotar stood in the center of the battleground, breathing heavily, covered in blood, both his own and his attackers, utterly victorious. The last great war had lasted 9 minutes and 37 seconds. 7 of the strongest males in the region, each capable of defeating ordinary lions, had been decisively defeated by a single aging animal. The victory secured Kotar's legacy beyond any possibility of dispute. He had not just won fights. He had faced overwhelming odds and prevailed through a combination of superior strength, superior intellect, superior will, and something else that seemed to transcend ordinary animal behavior. In the aftermath of the 7-male coalition fight, the scientific community seemed to shift its entire approach to understanding Kotar. Rather than trying to explain his success through conventional frameworks, researchers began to accept that they were witnessing something genuinely anomalous, something that might require new theoretical models to fully comprehend. Okonkwo published a second major paper in 2003 titled Neurological Adaptation and Phenotypic Expression in Apex Predators, Evidence for Cognitive Evolution in Real Time, in which he argued that Kotar might represent a genuine evolutionary leap in lion cognitive capability. The paper was even more controversial than his first, with some scientists dismissing it as pure speculation, while others saw it as a legitimate attempt to grapple with evidence that seemed to demand new explanatory frameworks. Throughout 2002 and 2003, as Kotar continued to age into his early 20s, the challenges gradually ceased. Other males seemed to have accepted what had become blindingly obvious. Challenging Kotar was not a path to territorial advancement. It was a path to serious injury or death. The few challenges that did occur during this period were mounted by young males who hadn't yet grasped the reality of Kotar's dominance, and they learned the lesson that every other lion in the region had already internalized. The great lion was unconquerable, but age, even for Kotar, eventually began to take its toll. By 2004, he was 23 years old, an age that no male lion should theoretically be able to reach. His movements, while still powerful, showed signs of stiffness. His roars, once capable of carrying for 30 kilometers, now seemed slightly diminished in carrying power. The silver in his mane increased. The scars from decades of fighting became more visible. Yet his mind remained sharp. His tactics remained sophisticated. His presence remained commanding. One of the most poignant observations from this period came from a young ranger named Michael Karayuki, who had been documenting Kotar's final years. Karayuki noted that Kotar seemed to take less pleasure in the occasional challenges that arose. He defeated his opponents as efficiently as ever, but without the apparent intensity of younger years. It was as if he was going through the motions, maintaining his dominance more from habit and ingrained behavior than from genuine competitive drive. Karayuki wrote, "I witnessed a predator at the twilight of his reign, a warrior who had conquered everything his world could throw at him, and who now seemed almost weary of his own invincibility." In 2004 and 2005, the final chapters of Kotar's reign unfolded with a kind of poetic inevitability. The challenges that had once come regularly now arrived rarely. When they did, Kotar defeated them with characteristic efficiency, but without the dramatic intensity of earlier confrontations. Ragnars noted that he spent more time resting, more time in solitary reflection. The pride of lionesses that had thrived under his protection remained healthy and well-fed, secured by his dominance. But even they seemed to recognize that their great protector was entering the final phase of his life. The historical record of Kotar's combat success during his 14-year reign is absolutely clear. 28 documented significant fights, 28 victories, 0 defeats. The statistical probability of such a record occurring through chance alone is so remote that it exists beyond meaningful calculation. The probability of a single male lion maintaining perfect dominance for 14 years is approximately 1 in several billion. Yet it happened. Kotar achieved what no other lion in recorded history has achieved: perfect, unbroken dominance for over a decade. What made Kotar's success even more remarkable was the nature of the challenges he faced. He wasn't fighting inexperienced young males. He wasn't facing malnourished opponents. He wasn't enjoying some temporary advantage that would eventually fade. The males who challenged him were often among the strongest in the region. The coalitions that formed against him were sophisticated and coordinated. The geographical advantages of his territory, while real, were not so overwhelming as to explain his perfect record. There had to be something more, something intrinsic to Kotar himself. Dr. Kumari's final paper on Kotar's physiology, published in 2005, presented a fascinating hypothesis. She theorized that Kotar's extraordinary success might have been rooted in a unique combination of genetic factors, behavioral training under his father Mamba, and what she called neuroplasticity under pressure. The theory suggested that lions, like other animals, can develop enhanced neural pathways in response to repeated challenges. Kotar, facing constant pressure throughout his reign, might have developed cognitive and physiological adaptations that compounded over time, making him progressively more formidable as he aged, rather than less formidable as would normally occur. The theory was speculative, but it offered a mechanism by which his legendary success could be understood within biological and evolutionary frameworks. Another intriguing aspect of Kotar's legacy involved what researchers called defensive territoriality. While most dominant lions maintained their territories through regular patrols and periodic fights, Kotar's approach was different. His presence alone was so intimidating that many potential challengers simply never attempted confrontation. The psychological dominance he exerted prevented many conflicts before they could develop. This meant that his perfect record of 28 victories came from a much larger universe of potential threats that never materialized into actual fights. How many males looked at Kotar, assessed their chances, and decided that discretion was the better part of valor? How many confrontations never happened precisely because Kotar's reputation made them seem futile? The answer was unknowable, but potentially significant. By 2005, as Kotar entered his 24th year of life, the scientific community had largely accepted what was once controversial. This was an extraordinary animal, an anomaly, a creature whose combination of physical attributes, intelligence, behavioral sophistication, and sheer force of will had allowed him to achieve something that transcended normal lion behavior. He had become in many ways a legend not just in folklore, but in documented scientific record. Universities taught courses examining his case. International wildlife conferences featured presentations analyzing his behavior. Zoos and wildlife centers around the world displayed photographs and information about the legendary lion of the Serengeti. Yet even as his fame spread, Kotar remained in his territory, living out his final years as he had lived his entire reign, on his own terms, answerable to no one, commanding absolute respect and acknowledgement of his dominance from every creature who inhabited his world. The young males who had once challenged him now served as a reminder of his power, their scarred bodies walking testaments to the consequences of opposing him. The lionesses of his pride thrived under his protection, secure in the knowledge that no outside force would ever challenge his rule. The ecosystem of his territory had reorganized itself around his existence, with prey animals, competing predators, and even scavenger species adapting their behaviors to the reality of his presence. The question that lingered in the minds of everyone who studied Kotar was fundamental. What was he? Was he simply an exceptional animal, representing the absolute upper extreme of what lion physiology and behavior could achieve? Or was he something more? An evolutionary development, a genetic mutation, a creature whose consciousness operated at a level that transcended normal animal cognition? These questions couldn't be answered with certainty, but they represented the boundaries of what science could explain about this remarkable creature. By 2006, Kotar had become more than just a lion. He had become a symbol of something larger, a testament to the heights that nature could achieve, a reminder that within the animal kingdom, true greatness could exist, that dominance could be maintained through intelligence and will as much as through brute force. The documentary crews that had filmed him over the years had created an extensive visual record of his reign. Universities possessed hundreds of hours of behavioral footage. Scientific journals contained dozens of peer-reviewed papers analyzing various aspects of his existence. Kotar had transcended the world of wildlife biology and entered the realm of cultural significance. Yet even as his legend grew, the end was approaching. Nature, for all of Kotar's extraordinary defiance of its typical patterns, ultimately answers to the same laws that govern all living things. Aging is relentless. Even an animal as remarkable as Kotar could not forever escape its inevitable progression. By early 2006, observers noted that his movements had slowed considerably. What had once been fluid motion became noticeably stiffer. His magnificent mane, though still dark and impressive, had thinned. His body, which had carried 480 pounds of muscle in his prime, now showed visible signs of muscle loss despite his continued hunting success. He was no longer the physical specimen he had been, yet his presence remained commanding, and any male lion foolish enough to challenge him still discovered that age had not significantly diminished his lethality. Dr. Okonkwo, who had now spent over 2 decades studying Kotar, noted in his final field journal entries a profound sadness at witnessing the great lion's decline. Okonkwo understood that he was watching the conclusion of something exceptional, the final chapters of a story that would never be fully replicated. He documented Kotar's movements with increased frequency, knowing that these final days were precious data, final observations of a creature that had already proven beyond doubt that it was unlike any other lion that had ever existed. The last significant challenge Kotar faced came in late 2006, when a coalition of 3 younger males, emboldened by the visible signs of his aging, decided that the time had finally come to challenge the legendary king. These males were strong, they were coordinated, they represented genuine threat. Observers gathered expecting, perhaps for the first time, to witness Kotar's defeat. The battle that ensued lasted approximately 12 minutes, significantly longer than most of his fights. At one point, one of the challengers managed to drive him to the ground, and for a moment the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. But Kotar, drawing on reserves of will that seemed almost supernatural, drove himself upright, threw off his attackers, and proceeded to defeat all 3 with devastating efficiency. The victory was Pyrrhic. Kotar emerged bloodied and clearly exhausted in ways he hadn't been before. The speed of his recovery from the exhaustion was noticeably slower. The wounds he sustained took longer to heal. The physical toll of the fight was visible in his body language for weeks afterward. Yet he had won. The record remained perfect. 29 documented significant fights, 29 victories, 0 defeats. At 25 years old, an age when male lions should have been long dead, Kotar had defeated 3 coordinated attackers who represented the best that the next generation had to offer. That final victory seemed to mark the end of an era. Few males attempted to challenge him after 2006. Word had apparently spread throughout the lion population of the region that Kotar, even in his decline, was still unconquerable. The young males who might have challenged him in his prime now looked to other territories, other opportunities, other paths to dominance. The great lion's reign had achieved such an unassailable position that challenges themselves became pointless. Kotar's final years, from 2006 through 2009, were spent in what observers described as contemplative rest. He maintained his territorial boundaries through presence and scent marking, rather than through fighting. He hunted less frequently, allowing the lionesses of his pride to provide most of the kills. He rested more, spending long hours under the shade of favorite acacia trees, sometimes apparently lost in thought, staring out across the Serengeti plains that had been his kingdom for so long. In 2009, at 28 years old, Kotar was definitively the oldest male lion ever documented in the wild. He should have been dead. By every measure of normal lion physiology, he should have succumbed to age, disease, or injury years earlier. Yet he endured, weaker perhaps than in his prime. Slower, certainly, but still powerful, still commanding, still absolutely dominant over his territory and everyone in it. Researchers could only speculate about the biological mechanisms that allowed him to survive so far beyond normal lifespan. Some theorized exceptional genetics. Others suggested that the constant mental stimulation of maintaining his dominance had kept his body younger than it should have been. Still others suggested that there might be elements of Kotar's physiology or behavior that science simply didn't yet understand. During this period, something remarkable occurred. A young male was born to one of Kotar's lionesses, and this cub displayed physical characteristics strikingly similar to Kotar himself, larger than his litter mates, growing faster, demonstrating unusual intelligence from early infancy. Researchers began to wonder whether Kotar's genetic material, combined with his lifetime of behavioral teaching to the pride, might produce a successor capable of continuing his legacy. Rangers named the cub Kotar Jr., and a new chapter in the legend seemed to be opening. But nature had other plans. In early 2010, Kotar began to show signs of serious illness. A respiratory infection, possibly pneumonia, developed in his aging lungs. Despite his exceptional constitution, even Kotar couldn't overcome the combined effects of extreme age and serious disease. For the first time since his dominance began 26 years earlier, Kotar appeared vulnerable, genuinely vulnerable. Rangers and researchers gathered, documenting the illness, knowing that they were witnessing the beginning of the end. The final days of Kotar's life unfolded in late March 2010. He retreated to a secluded area near a permanent water source, the same waterhole where he had established dominance all those years ago. The lionesses of his pride maintained a respectful distance, apparently understanding that the great male needed solitude. Researchers observed him drinking regularly, resting frequently, his breathing labored and difficult. On March 28, 2010, after a night of particularly heavy rainfall that echoed across the plains, rangers found Kotar lying motionless beneath his favorite acacia tree. He had died in the night, peacefully, in the territory that he had ruled so absolutely for so long. The news of Kotar's death reverberated across the scientific world. International media outlets that had covered his extraordinary life now published obituaries celebrating his achievements. Wildlife journals prepared memorial editions. Universities held commemorative lectures. The lion who had never lost a fight during his 14-year reign of absolute dominance had finally been defeated by the only opponent that every creature must eventually face, time itself. An autopsy performed by Dr. Kumari and her team revealed a body that bore the accumulated scars of 1,000 battles. Nearly every bone had been broken at some point and healed. His organs showed damage consistent with a lifetime of stress and combat. His joints were severely arthritic. His lungs showed signs of the pneumonia that had ultimately claimed his life. Yet his heart was enormous, larger than typical for lions, with cardiac tissue that showed unusual development. Kumari theorized that Kotar's exceptional cardiovascular system might have been one of the biological factors that allowed him to survive so long and endure so much. The scientific findings from the autopsy were compiled into a comprehensive report published jointly by multiple research institutions. The report concluded that Kotar represented a unique combination of genetic factors, environmental adaptation, behavioral sophistication, and what could only be described as an extraordinary force of will. His success couldn't be attributed to any single factor, but rather to an unusual confluence of advantages that had aligned in a single individual. The probability of such an alignment occurring again was so remote that it might never happen again in the documented history of lions. In the years following Kotar's death, his young son Kotar Jr. did indeed develop into a formidable lion. He inherited many of his father's physical characteristics and demonstrated similar intelligence and tactical sophistication. However, Junior never achieved the absolute perfection of his father's record. He lost his first significant fight at age 6, a confrontation with a coalition of 4 males. While he defeated them, he sustained injuries that, had his father faced them, might have seemed minor. The loss, relative to his father's perfection, suggested that Kotar had been truly unique, that his achievements were rooted not just in genetics or behavior that could be transmitted to offspring, but in something intrinsic to him alone. The legacy of Kotar extended far beyond the scientific world. He had become a cultural icon, a symbol of excellence and dominance in popular consciousness. Books were written about his life, documentaries were produced for international audiences, artists created sculptures and paintings memorializing his reign. In the villages surrounding the Serengeti, he became part of local oral tradition, spoken of as a legendary hero, a creature that transcended the boundaries between animal and myth. Perhaps most significantly, Kotar's life and achievements forced a fundamental reconsideration of how science understood animal cognition and capability. The idea that lions were simple creatures operating purely on instinct had to be abandoned. Kotar had demonstrated strategic thinking, emotional complexity, the ability to learn and adapt, the capacity for what could reasonably be called wisdom. He had shown that the gap between animal and human intelligence might not be as vast as previously assumed, that nature could produce creatures of remarkable sophistication, even within species not traditionally associated with higher cognition. 20 years after Kotar's death, his remains were carefully preserved and displayed in a museum dedicated to the wildlife of the Serengeti. Visitors from across the world came to see his skeleton, to learn about his extraordinary achievements, to contemplate what he had represented. The museum included detailed documentation of his fights, analysis of his behavior, scientific papers examining the factors that might have contributed to his success. It was a memorial to a remarkable creature and a testament to the heights that nature could achieve. In the end, the question that had animated researchers throughout Kotar's life remained only partially answered. What made him extraordinary? Science could document his physical attributes, analyze his behavior, examine his genetics, but something essential about Kotar seemed to elude full scientific explanation. Some observers spoke of it as an indomitable will, others described it as an exceptional intelligence. Still others suggested that there might be aspects of animal consciousness that science simply wasn't equipped to fully understand. Whatever the explanation, the facts remained undeniable and indisputable. For 14 consecutive years, from 1992 through 2006, Kotar never lost a single fight, against single opponents and coalitions, against experienced warriors and ambitious young males, against attackers who came from multiple directions with coordinated strategies. 29 documented significant battles, 29 absolute victories, 0 defeats, a record so perfect that it transcended sport or competition and entered the realm of the legendary and mythical. His dominance didn't just secure his own position, it shaped an entire ecosystem. Prey animals adapted their behaviors around his presence. Competing predators learned to hunt in different areas. Other lions recognized his superiority and organized their territorial claims around acknowledging his supreme position. The Serengeti Plains for over 2 decades bore the imprint of his rule, organized and structured around the reality of his existence. Even now, more than a decade after his death, Kotar's influence persists. Young male lions in the region still seem to inherit an almost instinctive reluctance to challenge for territory in certain areas, as if the memory of his dominance had somehow encoded itself into the cultural transmission of the pride. Researchers continue to study footage and documentation of his fights, continuing to discover new insights into his tactics and strategies. Universities still teach his story as a case study in animal behavior and evolutionary biology. The legend of Kotar, the lion who never lost a fight in 14 years, endures as perhaps the most extraordinary documented example of individual animal dominance in recorded history. He achieved something that defied statistical probability, that challenged our understanding of animal cognition, that reminded us that nature is capable of producing creatures of remarkable sophistication and power. In his reign, Kotar proved that greatness could exist in the animal kingdom, that an individual could achieve dominance so absolute and so complete that it transcended the normal patterns and rhythms of his species. He was, in every measurable sense, the greatest lion that ever lived. His story will endure as long as humans study the African wilderness, as long as we seek to understand the remarkable creatures that inhabit that vast continent. Kotar was more than a lion. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature, a living testament to the extraordinary heights that evolution could achieve when genetic capability, environmental advantage, behavioral sophistication, and an unbreakable will aligned in a single individual. He will forever remain the benchmark against which other lions are measured, the standard of perfection, the legend that inspired wonder and awe in everyone who learned of his extraordinary achievements. In the end, the question remains as profound as it was during his life. How does one explain Kotar? How does one account for his perfect record? How does one understand an animal that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of his species? The answer may never be fully known, but the achievement stands, undeniable, documented, real, a lion who never lost a fight in 14 years, a creature who achieved dominance so absolute that it will be studied, discussed, and marveled at for generations to come. Kotar was extraordinary, and his legacy will never fade.